Today, I am pleased to present a new book on the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, Rutherford's Coup, the Watchtower Succession Crisis of 1917 and its Aftermath. According to the history that the Organization of Jehovah's Witnesses presents to the world, Joseph Franklin Rutherford, the second president of the Watchtower Society, was a fearless and valiant Christian who stood up for truth and righteousness and who defeated the evil slave made up of 4 opposing brothers intent on taking over the organization following the death of its first president, Charles Taze Russell. After reading this extremely well-documented book, you will learn that all that is bunk. It's a lie. That in fact the reverse is true, and it was the brothers wrongly labeled evil slave who acted in a correct manner to try to prevent the takeover of the Watchtower Society by an autocrat. It is important for Jehovah's Witnesses to know this. Not only important, it is vital to the faith of witnesses to understand that the man which the current governing body claims was originally appointed by Jesus Christ himself in 1919 as the faithful and discreet slave, got to that position using means which cannot be described by any stretch of the imagination as faithful or discreet, but rather slanderous, underhanded, and completely false to any love of truth. Joining me today from his home in Sweden is the book's author, Ruud Persson. Welcome to the Berean Pickett's channel, Ruud. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, because in English it has a totally different connotation from the kind of person I know you to be.
My father was a very big fan of a Norwegian ski jumper by the name of Birger Ruud. He was the best ski jumper at that time, and he felt that I should have that name as my first name.
Very good.
Yeah.
So let's begin with you telling us how long you have been working on this book and what prompted you to begin this monumental work.
Well, it's in two phases. I began to study the issue deeply in 1973, but and I reached most of my conclusions already back then, but there were other matters that we had to attend to,
right.
And it was about 2010, something about that time, that I started to actually write the book.
Wow, so it's been in progress since that time. That's quite a feat.
And the reason I started this investigation was that there was contradictions in the society's presentation of history. On the one hand, they said that the officers of the society, 3 officers, president, vice president, and secretary, that they used to publish the books, not the board of directors. But then they quoted the charter of the society later on, or at least at another place, and they stated, and the charter stated that it was the board of directors that would be responsible for such things. So that was a contradiction, and I wanted to find out. And then, of course, the society played so much emphasis on this period, 1917 through 18, and Christ came to the temple, and a number of people were cast off as evil servants, etc. And I felt there is something amiss here, and I wanted to find out. And they for instance, they claimed that one leading character, Paul Johnson, that he claimed to be, in the end, claimed to be the world's high priest. That was difficult to believe.
Yeah.
And also they claimed that those who opposed Rutherford betrayed him and others to the authorities, so that they had to go to jail. That was also very powerful. Oh, could that really be so? I wanted to find out. That's why I started this research.
Right. Well, it's a must read for all Jehovah's Witnesses because it really explains the truth and is very, very well documented. It's quite thick. About half the book is the actual story following the death of Russell and leading into the presidency of Rutherford. But then you've also added a very comprehensive bibliography, or biographies, I should say, of the 20 individuals involved in that history. And it's a very revealing portrait of the makeup of the organization back then at the highest level. And as you just said, not terribly flattering to a lot of these individuals that, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses are taught to look up to as the chosen of God. I just wanted to read an excerpt from the book before we go on, because it really struck me. This was right at the funeral of Brother Russell, and this is so right there in the funeral, over the casket, and says, only a few feet removed from the dead body of our pastor, Brother Macmillan said, Brother Hoskins, I have something to tell you that I know will hurt you very much, and I haven't any idea that you have the strength of character sufficient to follow my advice, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I think that every one of you directors, except Brother Rutherford and Van Ambro, ought to resign and give a chance for some decent men who know something to be put in your places. There is not one of you fit to manage anything, and you ought to resign. And if you don't resign, you will, every one of you, get kicked out. What are your thoughts on that, Ruud?
Well, that was very revealing to myself already back in 1973. And when I read this, I felt I will see if they would contradict it. I will find out, did they contradict this? And all right, they published a rebuttal, but they didn't comment on that. Rutherford did not say anything about that. So I realized this is the truth. Oh, so Macmillan, he wasn't the Christian gentleman that he is often painted as.
Yes,
he was not nice at all, and in fact, I would like to call him Macvillain.
Wow.
Instead of Macmillan, because you see he's acting throughout this period, and he is so wrong in so many details. He says in his book are wrong. And I demonstrate that in my book.
Yes, you do. Yes. One I should mention, I'll probably mention several times, but what impressed me about this book is the level of documentation, the amount of historical documents you have been able to unearth. It takes up a major part of the book, actually, and it shows that these aren't conjectures. These are actual facts written down and recorded and have been unearthed, and it's about time we learned about these things. But didn't Russell provide clear direction on who would succeed him, and was Rutherford even named in that direction?
He had arranged for the board of directors to succeed him. He didn't want anyone to be his successor as a strong leader. It was the board of directors, and they would come to the fore, as Russell wrote, in the case of his death. And in the will, he also produced a will that was made known when Russell died, and Rutherford didn't play a significant part there. He was mentioned as for a reserve list for the Watchtower editors, but even the will said such small things as payment for people who produced articles should be decided by the board of directors. Even that little thing, the board of directors should decide, according to the will.
Yes, fascinating. Well, what about the infamous 7th volume of Studies in the Scriptures, the book that got the directors in trouble and finally imprisoned during the war? Was that written by Russell?
Not a single paragraph was written by Russell. It did contain a number of quotations and references to what Russell had earlier written on the book of Revelation and the book of Ezekiel.
Right.
But those comments were not meant specifically for the 7th volume. He hadn't written a specific, not even one paragraph.
Wow, isn't that something? How was Rutherford able to get legally appointed? To get the legally appointed corporation directors ousted and himself inserted into the role of president?
He had assumed leadership above the board. He was elected president, not by any just means, but he was elected in the early 1917. And when the directors found out that he was going to rule the society single-handed, they felt this is contrary to what the charter says, and it's contrary to what Russell wanted, and they started to make efforts to put him in place at the proper level. And he had already ordered the printing of this book, the 7th volume of Studies in the Scriptures, without them knowing. And he realized that, well, if I will not be in power, this venture would be in hazard. So he obtained a legal statement, a legal opinion from a lawyer in Pittsburgh, who claimed that these 4 directors who were his opponents, they were not legal directors. And he read that in the Bethel dining room on July 17, 1917. He read that opinion, and it came as a shock.
So that was the real problem they had at that time. It wasn't with the book, it was with, although there's lots to be complaining about with that book, as you reveal in your book. It's amazing what stuff that was in there. But they had a problem with him basically denouncing them as illegal directors and claiming for himself that authority. Yeah.
It was that date was only about he announced the book and said, it is here for you to take, but there was no discussion of the book because they he had ousted 4 directors and put new ones instead. And of course, and there were a big fuss about that, and there was one lawyer present there who objected to it.
So the editorial committee, which Rutherford also provided for in his will, wasn't consulted on that book. And as I understand it, was eventually dissolved by Rutherford so that he could have free sway to write whatever he wanted. Is that the case?
Russell had provided for an editorial committee, and there were 5 people mentioned. And there was a reserve list of people who might be chosen if somebody would resign or whatever.
Right.
And Rutherford was one of those reserves. And but before long, he was the leading. He came into that editorial committee, and because there were 2 people who resigned. And it was Rutherford and no one other who were chosen. And before long, Rutherford ruled that committee, and he wouldn't accept. From the start, he had to, but as time went by and he became more and more powerful, he didn't want any committee to decide. He would decide.
Right.
So in the end, he abolished the editorial committee.
Sounds like the actions of an authoritarian rather than a Christian.
Yeah, and he said that instead of the people, human beings would edit the Watchtower, Jehovah God himself would do that.
Well, this is documented. This is amazing. And Macmillan, or as you put him, name him Macmillan, again touted as an exceptional example of a faithful and discreet man. Yet we see a very different portrait of him in this. And I remember there was an incident in which he called the police to Bethel to oust legally appointed directors of the corporation. Is that true?
Yeah, that took place when Rutherford was out in the West, and he had left Macmillan in charge of the Bethel, and the four directors, and that was before they were ousted. They had heard a rumor that they were not allowed to visit the tabernacle. The tabernacle was close to the Bethel, and that was the place where most of the work was done. So they decided to find out, and they went there, all four of them. And they were told that those who are not working here are not allowed here on working hours. And suddenly Macmillan appeared and said, "Oh, get out!" And there was a call for, and he called for a police, and he sent one of those. Martin was his name, I think. He sent to get a police officer to have them removed from the tabernacle. And sure enough, the policeman arrived there, but when the director said that we are employed by the society, well, so the policeman said, "Well, I have to go." So
authority.
That was a very nasty thing.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Now, there's something interesting too I didn't know about. Rutherford's wife and his son did not attend his funeral, and they lived estranged from Rutherford for many years, though they continued to get support through the organization. Any idea what that was all about?
From the beginning, there seemed to have been a rather good relation within the family, but somewhere in the early 20s, things deteriorated, and Mrs. Rutherford, Mary, and Joseph, they didn't live together. He up to a certain point, he could visit her place, but before long, he lived in Brooklyn, and then in Beth Sarim, the place he had built in California, and the son, he became a member of a political party. I think it was in 1924. And I assume, and I'm not the only one, that this meant that he had left the Bible students.
Right.
And we don't know if it is possible that it had something to do with Joseph Rutherford.
Right. You know, what amazed me as I read through this book was the excessive importance everyone back then placed on finding some anti-typical application to almost every Bible account. Isn't it true that Rutherford thought the 7th volume of Studies in the Scriptures typified the denarius or penny from Jesus' parable of the 11th hour workers?
Oh, yeah. In fact, the 7th volume, the so-called 7th volume, which was named The Finished Mystery, it was published as the penny of the parable. And there is a picture of that penny within the book, at the beginning of the book.
Right.
And he gave the penny. He was the important man in that parable who provided the penny, and those who had criticized him were blamed as called murmurers of the parable.
Wow. Dear. Isn't it true that Rutherford at one point promoted the purchase of war bonds in support of the First World War effort? Hardly sounds like a faithful and discreet slave action there.
That is the case. When they felt the authorities, the American authorities, increasingly were hostile to them.
Mm.
And they were asked to buy war bonds, or liberty bonds, as it was technically called.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, Rutherford said, okay, there are many of us who have bought liberty bonds.
Mm.
We are not against liberty bonds. In fact, if you can buy them, buy them.
Mm.
And that caused a terrific row in the movement,
Sure.
because that was a compromise of the worst sort.
Right.
And one movement actually that left the society came into being because of that, the Standfast movement.
Ah, interesting. Yes. What about the Millions Now Living Will Never Die campaign that Rutherford launched after Russell's death, and the subsequent construction of the Beth Sarim mansion? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it was already in 1918 that Rutherford gave this talk, Millions Now Living Will Never Die. And it was printed as a booklet, a little book or booklet. I think it was in 1920. Mm. And in that booklet, the millions now living will never die. Why was it so? It was because the end or the millennium or the paradise or God's kingdom on earth would be in full swing here on earth in 1925. Mm. Therefore, millions then living, not now living, then living, but it was now then, would never die, because they would live in 1925 and live in onto the new paradise earth and continue to live. So it was one of the falsest proclamations ever made. Mm.
Yeah, it's hard to say anything and it's hard to say that wasn't an out-and-out prophecy.
Well, it was stated that you could expect that to happen, and even Macmillan at one point, he had held a speech in New York where he said the same, and the New York Times reported it, and I show this in my book. This how he said the millennium will be here in 25, and it didn't happen.
No.
Well, Rutherford's health deteriorated. Mm-hmm. He had a lung problem, and it became difficult for him to live in New York during winter time. So it was recommended, and then that he should live in San Diego, in California, because the climate was very healthy for him.
Sure.
And well, he couldn't say, and that was the reason why this house or palace, Beth Sarim, was built. About 1930, he moved into that, and he couldn't say, well, it wasn't good to say that, well, this mansion is for me. Mm-hmm. So he came up with a silly red herring that it was to be for the princes to come, who would return to Earth very soon. House of the princes, they would return. Old Testament saints, so to speak, they would live there.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, in waiting for them, he could live there.
He was like the caretaker.
Yeah. But it wasn't built for them. It was built only for him.
Sure.
And consequently, when he died, very soon afterwards, it was sold. Mm. And then there was a newspaper in California which said, "Oh, now the old faithful ones, they will have to find their own homes now."
Oh, dear me. There was something about didn't he slander some, or libel actually, because it was in print in the publications, someone and ended up being successfully sued by that person?
Yeah, it was a lawyer working under Rutherford by the name of Olin Moyle.
Mm.
And Moyle saw things he didn't like at headquarters. And he decided we will have to leave here, he and his wife. And he left a letter for Rutherford where he explained why they had to leave.
Mm.
And oh boy, with Rutherford, he became angry. He didn't call him aside to talk things over. No, he attacked him in front of all the Bethel people, and he was called all evil terms was used about him. And even in the Watchtower, he left Bethel, but even in the Watchtower, it was stated. And so in the end, Olin Moyle, he was a lawyer, he sued. Mm-hmm. He sued them, Rutherford and the people who were on the directors.
Right.
He sued them. And before the case came up, Rutherford died. Mm. So he couldn't have him. He couldn't pursue about him.
Right.
But the others he did. Mm. And in the end, the society lost the case, and Olin Moyle won the case, and they were fined. They heavy fine.
Yes.
And they had to pay. And they acknowledged in their magazine, I think it was not the Watchtower, it was the other one. They admit that this sum was handed over to Moyle.
And it was a substantial sum. When you work out the amount of that sum adjusted for inflation, it was a huge amount of money they had to pay out.
That was a huge amount of money. Yeah.
I was also fascinated by the biography of George H. Fisher, who initially supported Russell in his takeover bid. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book and then ask you to comment on it. It says, on the Wednesday evening before Memorial, 1926, Brother J.F. Rutherford, accompanied by two elders and a sister, attended the Paris edition of the notorious show Artists and Models in Al Jolson's Winter Garden Theater on Broadway, New York City. The chief attraction of this burlesque show is the exhibition of nude women on the stage. It is generally known as notoriously offensive against decency and public morals. The two witnesses required by the scriptures are ready to testify before the New York Church, before which also this charge has been lodged. And that was from George H. Fisher. Why did nothing ever come of that?
There is one very, very good reason for this, and poor George Fisher died before this happened. He died of a heart attack, and and he was the major force behind that, and he was a good name too. But the Bible students at the time, those who were connected with Rutherford, they were so, they approved of almost anything he would do. And he would be able to pull strings in his own favor, probably. But even if there would have been a church trial, and even if it would be convicted, most witnesses, Bible students at the time,
right.
They would just say, oh, it's a matter of imperfection, nothing to make a fuss of.
Nothing has really changed. The desire people have to follow men over the Christ continues down to the modern day organization.
Yeah.
Now we come to an interesting thing here. Rutherford ousted the four dissident directors in July of 1917. The society claims in Jehovah's Witnesses and the Divine Purpose, published 1959, page 71, that their attorney confirmed that they had never legally been members of the board of directors, and that Rutherford therefore was within his right in refusing to consider them as such. What does your research show?
Oh, that was one of the first things I learned. This was a complete 100% lie. That lawyer, he by the name of Francis H. McGee, was probably the most brilliant lawyer they had and most prominent lawyer there was in the movement. And he was an assistant to the Attorney General of New Jersey. And he was present when Rutherford read his opinion, this legal opinion, and stated that he had replaced them. And he said, he's taking the law in his own hands, an unlawful thing to do. And he recommended those who he had appointed, don't accept this position. And nothing but the court of law could declare their positions on the board vacant.
Wow.
They lied.
They lied, and it was in 1959 under that book, the Jehovah's Witnesses to the Divine Purpose. So this isn't even Rutherford lying. This is now Nathan H. Knorr and Fred Frand.
Yeah. And Rutherford never once dared to mention McGee by name. There were debates between them, and Rutherford. At one point he lost so terribly that he cried openly.
Really? Wow. Well, thank you so much, Ruud, for giving us this small glimpse into the treasure of research and revelation that is this masterpiece of historical research. I'm going to hold it up again. This is the book. This little banner is just because this is our proof copy. This was filmed before the book was actually published, but I'm releasing it today because today is the day that it's been published on Amazon, and I'll soon provide you with links for that if you'd wish to purchase it. I'd highly recommend that all Jehovah's Witnesses really read this book to learn about their own history and the facts of it so that they can make their own determination. And I want to thank you again for joining us and giving us this. Just thank you for this research. It's just wonderful.
Thank you yourself.
Okay, bye for now. I would like to conclude by reading an excerpt from the book's conclusion that explains why this is more than just a piece of history, but rather information with great relevance to Jehovah's Witnesses today. The Faithful and Discreet Slave. The current view is outlined in the Watchtower, July 15, 2013, pages 11, 22, and 23, is that Jesus began to inspect the spiritual temple in 1914, and that this inspection lasted from 1914 to the early part of 1919, and that he was pleased with a band of loyal Bible students. So it is further claimed, in 1919, Jesus selected capable anointed brothers to be his faithful and discreet slave. They added that the anointed brothers who make up the faithful slave have served together at headquarters. This would mean that Rutherford and his allies were selected by Jesus in 1919 to be his faithful and discreet slave. However, there is no evidence that Jesus actually undertook an inspection of the spiritual temple from 1914 to 1919. Moreover, the Society's claim about its leaders is simply inconceivable. These leaders had demonstrated utmost corruption in dealing with those who wanted to follow the instructions left by Russell. And Russell himself was considered to be the faithful and discreet slave by everyone involved in the difficulties, including Rutherford. There is no way that Jesus could have been pleased with Rutherford and his crew at that time. Why, they had constantly lied about their opponents, even going so far as to falsely claim that these had betrayed them to the authorities in 1918. They had also in 1917 published and pushed the perhaps worst publication ever put out by the Society, a book laden with idolatrous worship of C.T. Russell and full of false predictions. And they had denounced those Bible students who rightfully rejected that book. How could Jesus possibly be pleased with that? In addition, they had compromised over the war issue, among other things condoning buying war bonds. Some even claimed in court that they were not against the war. Did these leaders not rather display the characteristics of the evil slave that Jesus mentioned at Matthew 24:48 and 49? The governing body of today has tied its claim to authority back to a time in 1919 when the men in charge were anything but faithful and discreet. If their conduct would make it inconceivable that Jesus would appoint them as his faithful and discreet slave, then the chain of authority was broken before it even began. I urge everyone to buy and read this book, this important work, and draw their own conclusions from the evidence presented. It is now available on Amazon.com, and I will put the links to it in the description field of this video, or you can simply go to Amazon.com and type in the title Rutherford's Coup, The Watchtower Succession Crisis of 1917 and Its Aftermath. Thank you so much for your attention and for continuing to support this channel.